The bread was gone. Sarah Hale stood on her frostbitten porch in the gray half-light of a January morning, staring at the empty wooden board she had set out the night before, her breath coming in short white clouds that dissolved into the bitter Colorado air. The bread was gone, and in its place sat a dressed rabbit, its fur already stiff with cold, laid with a precision and care that no animal could have managed. Her heart hammered against her ribs with a force that frightened her, because this was not the first time, and she knew with absolute certainty now that someone was watching her. Someone had been watching her all winter long. She spun on her heel and scanned the tree line, that dark and impenetrable wall of pine and spruce that pressed against the edge of her property like a secret too large to contain. Nothing moved. The snow lay undisturbed in every direction except for a single line of tracks, boots rather than hooves, leading from the trees to her porch steps and back again into the darkness of the forest. Large tracks. A man's tracks. Her hand flew to the doorframe to steady herself, and for one terrible, suspended moment, every dark fear she had carried since her husband's death rose up inside her like floodwater. A stranger, a hidden presence, a trap, perhaps, laid with patience and cunning. She thought of the other things she had found over the past weeks: the pheasant in late November, the brace of quail in December, the haunches of venison wrapped carefully in burlap just before Christmas. She had told herself it was a neighbor's charity, left anonymously out of pity for the widow woman trying to survive the high mountain winter alone. She had even told herself it was wild animals, and that she had imagined the careful placement, the deliberate arrangement of each offering. But she could no longer deceive herself, because whoever had left those gifts had also accepted her bread every single morning, and the understanding of that exchange struck her with the force of a physical blow. This was not random charity. This was not pity. This was a conversation happening entirely in silence, conducted across the language of food and survival, and she had been a willing participant without ever knowing it. She pressed her hand against her chest and forced herself to breathe. Then, because Sarah Hale had survived things that would have broken lesser women, and because the cold was eating through her wool dress, and she had a farm to run and 2 horses to feed, and a dozen chickens who would riot if she did not get to them, she picked up the stiff rabbit, took it inside, and started to figure out what kind of man would spend an entire winter feeding a woman he had never spoken to. It had started in October, though she had not understood what she was seeing at the time. She had arrived in the San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado in the late summer of 1882, having sold almost everything she owned in St. Louis to purchase 40 acres of high meadow land from a man named Garrett who had given up on the mountains after 2 brutal winters and wanted nothing more than a train ticket back east. The land had been described to her in a letter as productive and well situated, with a solid cabin, a cleared field, and a reliable creek. What Garrett had failed to mention was that the nearest town, a raw little settlement called Dunmore, was 11 miles south through country that became actively hostile between November and April. He had also failed to mention that the mountains in that part of Colorado were not merely geographic features, but living forces with genuine opinions about human ambition. Sarah had not cared. She had needed to disappear, and the San Juan Mountains had seemed like the most effective place in the world to do it. Her husband, Thomas Hale, had been dead for 14 months when she arrived in Colorado. He had been a good man in most of the ways that mattered, a merchant in St. Louis with a head for numbers and a genuine affection for her. But he had also carried debts that he had never told her about. And when he died of a sudden fever in the summer of 1881, those debts had come calling in the form of 2 very unpleasant men who had given her a choice between marriage to a business associate of theirs or the loss of the house and everything in it. She had chosen a third option, which was to liquidate every asset she could lay her hands on, pay every debt she could prove was legitimate, and leave Missouri altogether. At 27 years old, Sarah Hale was not the kind of woman who did things halfway. She had grown up on a working farm in Ohio before her family moved to the city, and she remembered more about hard physical labor than most women of her social station were supposed to. She had decided that if she was going to rebuild her life, she was going to do it in a place where nobody knew her name and nobody could find her, and she had applied that same methodical determination to acquiring land and making it work. The first 2 months had been exhausting but manageable. The cabin was solid, better than she had hoped, with thick log walls and a fireplace large enough to heat the whole space. The creek ran clear and cold 50 yards from the back door. The field had grown hay that summer, and she had managed to cut and store enough to get her 2 horses and a small milk cow through the winter. She had put up vegetables, smoked fish from the creek, traded work with a farming family named Alderman who lived 4 miles down the mountain for extra stores of grain and salt pork. She had been, by any reasonable assessment, doing well. And then the first snow had come in early November, and the world had contracted to the size of her 40 acres, and she had understood for the first time what isolation actually meant. She was not afraid of solitude. She had learned to be comfortable in her own company over years of a marriage that was affectionate but not particularly intimate. What she was afraid of, and she acknowledged this only to herself in the deep quiet of sleepless nights, was the specific vulnerability of a woman alone in a place where the nearest help was 11 miles away through impassable winter roads. She had a rifle, and she knew how to use it. She had a solid door with a good bar. But fear was not always rational, and the dark and the wind and the vast indifferent silence of the mountain pressed on her in ways she had not anticipated. It was in that state of quiet, contained fear that she had first noticed the pheasant. She had gone out on a cold morning in mid-November to break the ice on the horse trough and had nearly stepped on it. A cock pheasant, fully dressed, cleaned and ready for the pot, laid on the second porch step as though placed there with deliberate care. She had looked around with her heart jumping in her chest and seen nothing, no tracks, no movement, nothing. She had taken the pheasant inside and eaten it over 3 days and told herself it was a random act of generosity from one of the aldermans perhaps, who knew she was alone up here. The next gift came 10 days later. Quail, 2 of them, dressed the same way. Then a portion of venison. Then a wild turkey just before Christmas that had fed her magnificently for days. Each time she looked for tracks and found nothing, or found evidence so faint she could not be certain of it in the hard-packed snow. Then in January she had done something impulsive that she still could not fully explain to herself. She had baked an extra loaf of bread, the dense, dark rye bread she made every week, and she had set it on the porch board with a vague and irrational feeling that she was leaving something out for a creature of the woods, the way you put out scraps for a dog that was not quite tame. She had told herself it was foolish. She had gone to bed feeling faintly ridiculous. The bread had been gone in the morning. And now, 5 weeks later, standing in her kitchen with a stiff rabbit in her hands, and the certain knowledge that a man had been feeding her all winter and accepting her bread in return, she felt the ground of her carefully constructed solitude shift beneath her feet in a way that was frightening, and if she was entirely honest with herself, not entirely unwelcome. She spent 2 days thinking before she did anything about it. On the 3rd day she baked her bread as usual, set it on the porch board as usual, and then on impulse she left a note beside it. She did not write much. She wrote only, "I would like to know who I am speaking with." She weighted the note with a small stone against the wind and went inside and spent a largely sleepless night alternating between feeling very brave and feeling very foolish. In the morning the bread was gone and the note was gone, and in their place was a single rabbit again, and beneath the rabbit, carefully protected from the cold, a small folded piece of paper. She opened it with fingers that were not entirely steady. The handwriting was deliberate and careful, as though written by someone who did not write often and wanted to be taken seriously when they did. It said, "Daniel Whitaker. I trapped the high country. I meant no harm." She read it 3 times. Then she sat down at her kitchen table and read it 3 more times, and something that had been wound very tight inside her chest all winter began, very slowly, to ease. Daniel Whitaker had come to the San Juan Mountains 4 years earlier with the specific intention of disappearing, a goal he shared with Sarah Hale without either of them knowing it. He was 32 years old and built for the kind of life he had chosen, broad through the shoulders and long in the leg, with hands that showed the evidence of years of heavy outdoor work, and a face that had been weathered by altitude and weather into something angular and quiet. He had grown up in Western Virginia in a family of 12, the third son of a subsistence farmer, and had left at 17 to find work, drifting west the way many young men did in those years, following the possibilities that kept receding toward the horizon. He had done a great many things in the 15 years between leaving his father's farm and arriving in Colorado. He had worked cattle drives out of Texas, had spent 2 years working a silver mine in Nevada that had ultimately proved worthless, had briefly been a deputy sheriff in a Kansas cow town before he had done something that forced him to move on, a thing he did not discuss and did not think about if he could help it. He had eventually found his way to the high mountains of Colorado, had learned trapping and the habits of the country from an old French-Canadian man named Beaumont who had lived in those mountains for 30 years, and who had died in his sleep in the winter of 1880, and left Daniel the use of his cabin and his trap lines and the deep, absorbed knowledge of the mountain that he had spent a lifetime accumulating. Daniel had accepted the gift with the solemnity it deserved, and had never looked back. He was not a hermit by temperament. He went to Dunmore for supplies 3 or 4 times a year, traded his furs, had a drink and a conversation at the saloon there, and returned to the mountain with no great regret. He liked people well enough in the abstract. He simply did not feel the need for them in any continuous way, and the mountain rewarded his self-sufficiency with a quality of solitude that he had come to value more than almost anything else in his life. He had known about the woman on the Garrett place before she arrived. Word traveled fast in small mountain communities, and the story had come to him through the aldermans, who had mentioned in passing that a widow woman from Missouri had bought the 40 acres up at the North Meadow and was going to try to make a go of it. He had paid it roughly the same attention he paid most news, which was to register it and file it away and not think about it again. Then winter had come, and he had begun running his northern trap lines, which took him through the territory adjacent to the Garrett place, and he had started noticing things. The first thing he noticed was that she knew what she was doing. The hay she had cut and stored was properly dried and stacked. The woodpile was enormous, which told him she had understood the advice she had presumably received about how much wood a mountain winter required. The horses looked well-fed and healthy. The cabin showed light in the evenings at a reasonable hour and went dark at a reasonable hour, which meant she was not wasting oil and was keeping a sensible schedule. The second thing he noticed was that she was hunting, or trying to. He found her tracks in the snow on several occasions, cautious and methodical, circling around areas where game was scarce. She had a rifle and she was using it, but the high country in winter gave up its game grudgingly to anyone who did not know its specific rhythms and patterns, and it was clear she was working much harder for much less than she needed to. He did not plan the first gift. He had taken a pheasant from one of his snares, a beautiful cock bird, and he had been walking past the edge of her property, and he had simply stopped and thought about her, alone in that cabin with the winter pressing in, working twice as hard as necessary for half the results she needed, and before he had fully reasoned through the decision he had dressed the bird and left it on her porch step and walked away quickly, feeling obscurely embarrassed. He told himself it was a neighborly gesture and nothing more. He was not entirely honest with himself about this. There was something about the way she had set up her life that he found himself thinking about at odd moments, out on the trap lines in the early gray mornings, or in his cabin in the evenings by the fire. She had come to this hard country alone, had clearly chosen it deliberately, was clearly competent and serious, and not making any drama about the difficulty of what she was doing. He respected that, genuinely. He had known many men who could not have done what she was doing. He respected it, and something about the quality of her solitude, the way she seemed to inhabit it with the same determined capability she brought to everything else, resonated with something in him that he was not sure he had a name for. He left the quail because he had come across a covey of them near her property and the taking was easy, and it seemed wasteful not to leave her some. He left the venison because he had taken a deer and had more than he could use. He told himself these explanations were sufficient and complete. Then she had left the bread. He had come to the edge of her property on a cold January morning and seen it there on the board, a loaf of dark rye bread, and he had stood in the tree line for 10 full minutes trying to understand it. It was possible it was not for him. It was possible she left bread out for any number of other reasons. But the way it was placed, the deliberate centrality of it on the board, the fact that she had not done this before, suggested very strongly that it was an answer to something. An acknowledgement. He had taken it, feeling a warmth in his chest that was completely disproportionate to the receipt of a loaf of bread, and had gone home and eaten it over several days and found it extraordinary, dense and complex and carefully made, better than any bread he had tasted in years. After that, the exchange had become, in his private understanding of it, a conversation. He brought game. She left bread. Neither of them said anything about it, or saw each other, or indicated in any direct way that the arrangement was anything other than two practical people making efficient use of available resources. He maintained this fiction with considerable determination right up until the moment he saw her note. "I would like to know who I am speaking with." He had stood in the cold holding that note for a long time, and the feeling that moved through him was something he recognized with a kind of horrified clarity as the beginning of something he was not sure he was equipped to handle. After he had written his reply and she had written back, the notes began to multiply. It happened gradually, the way most important things happen, one small step at a time, each one logical and reasonable in isolation. She thanked him. He said it was no trouble. She asked if he had been trapping these mountains long. He told her about Beaumont and the trap lines. She mentioned that she was finding the winter harder than she had expected in terms of game, but easier than expected in terms of the cold, because the cabin was well built. He told her the spot north of her creek where the rabbits were heaviest in winter. She asked if he was from Colorado. He said no, Virginia originally, but that was a long time ago. Each note went under the bread or under the game, depending on the direction. Each one was brief, cautious, careful. They were both, in their different ways, people who had learned to be careful, but the notes got longer. She told him about the farm in Ohio where she had grown up, and the way her father had taught her to read the weather by the color of the evening sky. He told her about Beaumont, who had been the best teacher he had ever had, and who had known these mountains the way most men know their own rooms. She mentioned, without elaborating, that she had left Missouri under circumstances that made her prefer not to be found, and he had replied, without elaborating, that he understood that better than she might think, and that the mountains were a good place for it. By February they were riding several times a week, and he had begun to look forward to the walk to the edge of her property with an eagerness that he monitored with some suspicion, because eagerness had historically preceded every mistake he had ever made. In February, she asked if he would consider meeting her in person. He held this question for 3 days without answering it, which was unusual. He was not a man who struggled with decisions. He made his choices and lived with them, and did not spend much time revisiting them. But this question unsettled something in him that went deeper than simple logistics, because meeting her would change the nature of what they were to each other, and he was not sure he was prepared for what it might change it into. The truth he had been avoiding, in the way he had been avoiding it since approximately the second rabbit, was that he thought about Sarah Hale a great deal more than was justified by neighborly concern. He thought about her in the mornings and in the evenings and sometimes in the middle of difficult tasks on the trap lines. And the thinking had a quality of warmth and attention that he recognized as something he had not felt since he was a much younger man who had not yet learned the particular consequences of feeling things too deeply in a world that was not always kind about it. He had loved a woman once in Kansas, before the thing he did not discuss. Her name had been Eliza, and she had been clever and brave, and she had believed in him more completely than he had deserved, and the way things had ended had convinced him, with the persuasive certainty of real pain, that the specific combination of himself and romantic love was one of those things that sounded reasonable in theory and produced catastrophe in practice. He wrote back on the fourth day. He said he thought that would be fine. They agreed to meet on the first mild day in late February, in the morning, at the edge of her property near the creek. He arrived early and stood in the trees for 20 minutes telling himself this was a courtesy visit between neighbors and not the source of the considerable anxiety currently occupying his entire nervous system. She came out of the cabin at the arranged time, wearing a heavy wool coat that was too large for her, probably a man's coat, and a knitted hat that came down over her ears, and she walked to the creek with the brisk, purposeful stride of someone who did not waste energy on hesitation. He stepped out of the trees when she was 10 yards away. They stopped and looked at each other. He had not tried to imagine what she looked like, which was unusual for him, because he was generally observant and curious. Perhaps he had not let himself imagine it. She was not what he might have pictured if he had allowed himself to picture anything, which was to say she was vivid in a way that the vague general category of a widow woman had not prepared him for. Dark hair pulled back under the hat, the kind of dark that caught the thin winter light. Brown eyes that were doing what his were presumably doing, which was taking a complete and rapid inventory. A face that was neither soft nor severe but somewhere in between, a face that showed both its intelligence and its experience without apology. She said, "You are taller than I imagined." He said, "You are younger than I expected." She smiled, and it was a quick, genuine smile, over before it was fully started, and he felt something shift in his chest with the specific heaviness of a door opening. They stood in the cold for 2 hours and talked. It was not a difficult conversation. That was the thing he would remember afterward, the ease of it, which should perhaps have alarmed him more than it did. She asked him questions and he answered them honestly, more honestly than he was generally inclined to be with people he had just met, and she told him things in return that he could tell she did not tell many people. Not the secret things, not yet, but the shape of herself, the outline of who she was and how she thought about things. She told him that she had come to this country partly to be safe and partly to prove something to herself, and that she was not entirely sure anymore which of those motivations was stronger. He told her that he understood the impulse to put distance between yourself and the version of you that other people had decided you were. She had looked at him with a directness that made it difficult to look away and said, "Yes, that is exactly it." When she went inside, because the cold had finally won, he walked back to his cabin through the late afternoon light feeling as though the mountain were subtly different than it had been that morning, which he knew was a sentimental and irrational thing to feel and felt anyway. He left game the next morning as usual. She left bread. But there was also a note that said only, "Same time Friday if you are willing." He was willing. They met every Friday through the rest of February and into March, and the conversations deepened in the way conversations do when two people who are accustomed to silence find someone else who uses it well. She told him about Thomas and the debts and the men who had tried to take her choices away from her, and her voice when she told it was steady and clear, and only a little hard at the edges. He told her about the trap lines in Beaumont and the specific grammar of the high country in winter. He talked about his childhood in Virginia, the poverty of it and also the beauty, the way the mountains had always felt more like home than any house. He did not tell her about Kansas. Not yet. The dark past he carried from that time sat in him like a stone he had learned to walk around, and he was not ready to put it between them. In March, the snow began to soften, and the first animals of spring started to be heard in the mornings, and the world began the slow annual miracle of its return. And Sarah started a kitchen garden in the south-facing window of her cabin, and told him about it in one of their Friday meetings with a kind of pride that he found completely charming and slightly devastating. She was making a life here. She was putting down roots in the specific soil of this mountain in a way that was deliberate and permanent, and the knowledge of it did something to the way he thought about his own life, which had been, he now understood, quite deliberately rootless. It was in March that he first noticed the Alderman boys paying an unusual amount of attention to the Garrett place. The Aldermans were a family of solid, practical people, the father and mother and 3 sons, all of whom farmed the lower meadow 4 miles south. The father, Cal Alderman, was a man he respected and occasionally traded work with. The 2 older sons were decent enough. The youngest, a 22-year-old named Pete Alderman, had a quality of entitlement and a tendency toward assumption that Daniel had always found slightly concerning, but had never had direct reason to address. He began to see Pete Alderman's tracks near the edge of Sarah's property in late March, close to the creek, close to the path she used for her daily walk. It was possible there was an innocent explanation. Pete ran some cattle in the upper meadow in spring and summer, and had legitimate reason to be in the area. But the tracks were too close and too frequent, and something in their pattern had the specific quality of surveillance rather than transit. He said nothing to Sarah about it immediately. He told himself he was monitoring the situation and gathering information before making any statement that might alarm her unnecessarily. He was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that he was also protecting something, the particular intimacy of what they had built together, from the introduction of an external complication. He was wrong to wait. He understood that later. In early April, on a morning when he was running the eastern trap line, he came around a stand of spruce and found Pete Alderman standing at Sarah's fence line, not doing anything in particular, just standing there watching her cabin. The young man had not heard him coming, which told Daniel something about Pete Alderman's level of attentiveness in conditions where he might have expected to be observed. Daniel said, quietly, "That would be private property you are looking at." Pete Alderman turned with a start, and then arranged his face into something that was intended to look unconcerned, and achieved instead a credible impression of a man who had been caught doing something and knew it. He was a young man of average height and a certain wiry restlessness, with his father's blue eyes and something in the set of his jaw that his father did not have, a kind of calculation. He said, "Whitaker. Did not know you were running lines this far east." "I run lines where the trapping is," Daniel said. "Heard you have been spending time with the widow woman," Pete said, and there was something in the way he said it, a particular emphasis that made Daniel's jaw tighten. "Mrs. Hale is a neighbor," Daniel said. "She is a young widow woman alone on a mountain," Pete Alderman said, with the air of someone explaining something obvious. "My father has been saying she ought to consider her options. There are men around here who would be interested in offering her a secure situation." Daniel looked at him for a long moment, during which he chose his words with considerable care, because his first instinct was to say something blunt and irrevocable about what kind of situation Pete Alderman was likely to be offering. He said, "Mrs. Hale strikes me as a woman who is capable of identifying her own options without assistance." "Maybe," Pete said, "but a woman alone up here, come winter again, might find she needs more than she thinks she does right now." Daniel stepped closer. He was taller than Pete Alderman by several inches and broader by a meaningful margin, and he was aware of using that fact, not with any gesture, but with the simple physical reality of his presence. He said, in a voice that was very quiet and very clear, "I would find a different place to walk." Pete Alderman looked at him for a moment with those calculating blue eyes and then looked away first. He said something under his breath that Daniel chose not to respond to and walked away down the slope toward the lower meadow, and Daniel watched him go until he was out of sight. Then he walked to Sarah's cabin and knocked on the door. She opened it with flour on her hands and a look of mild surprise, because they had not established a habit of unscheduled visits, and he explained what he had just seen in plain, factual terms without embellishment. He watched her face move through several expressions very quickly, the first one annoyance, the second something that might have been fear if she had let it be, but she did not let it be, and the third was a kind of resolved clarity that he had come to recognize as her particular response to things that could not be unmade by worrying about them. She said, "I appreciate you telling me. I have been aware he sometimes comes by." "You have?" He was surprised. "Why did you not say something?" "I did not want to make it larger than it was," she said, which was an answer he recognized from his own interior management of the same situation, and it made him feel simultaneously understood and faintly exasperated, because they had both been protecting the same thing in the same way while a potential problem quietly grew. He said, "Sarah." It was the first time he had used her first name without the courtesy title, and they both noticed it. She did not correct him. He said, "I would feel better if I could come by more regularly, not just on Fridays, if that would be agreeable to you." She looked at him for a moment in that direct, considering way she had, and said, "I think that would be more than agreeable." April turned the mountain into something extravagant. The snow retreated up the slopes and the meadows went from white to gray to a tender, impossible green almost overnight, and the creek ran high and cold and fast with snowmelt that foamed white around the rocks. Sarah's kitchen garden moved from the window to the actual ground, and she spent every mild morning on her knees in the earth, with a look of concentration and pleasure on her face that made Daniel want to stay and watch for longer than was strictly necessary. He came by most mornings now, on the pretext of various practical purposes that were not entirely pretexts, helping with fence repair, checking the creek for winter damage to her water intake pipe, splitting the extra wood she would need for the following winter. He discovered that working alongside her had a quality of ease and satisfaction that working alone, which he had always considered perfectly sufficient, could not quite match. She was competent in a way that genuinely pleased him. She did not ask for help she did not need and accepted help she did need, without making a performance of it in either direction. She had opinions about everything and expressed them clearly and without apology, and was willing to hear contrary opinions and change her mind if the reasoning warranted it, which was a quality he considered quite rare and quite valuable. She had a dry, spare sense of humor that surfaced unexpectedly in the middle of practical conversations, and that he found himself anticipating in the way he anticipated good weather. He also noticed, because he was a man who had spent years paying close attention to the details of living things, that she watched him sometimes when she thought he was not aware of it, with an expression that was not quite neutral. He was careful not to put too much weight on this observation. He had been wrong about this kind of thing before. In May, Cal Alderman came by on a Saturday morning when Daniel was at Sarah's cabin helping her hang a new door on the chicken coop. The older man rode up on a gray horse and greeted them both with the straightforward warmth of someone who had decided not to make any part of this complicated. He talked for 20 minutes about the spring, about his cattle, about the condition of the road into Dunmore. Then, before he left, he said to Daniel, in a tone that had gotten quieter, "Pete has been a trouble since Christmas. I apologize for whatever trouble he may have given." "I have spoken to him directly," Daniel said. "I appreciate that." Cal Alderman looked between them both with a farmer's unromantic perceptiveness and said, "Good neighbors are worth a great deal in country like this," and rode away, and Sarah watched him go with a small smile and said, "I like that man." "He is solid," Daniel agreed. She handed him the other end of the door. Their hands were close on the wood, and neither of them moved apart from each other as quickly as the task required. May became June, and June had the long golden evenings that the high country produced in summer, the light lasting until 9 o'clock and the air full of the smell of warming pine and meadow grass, and they had begun to eat supper together on the evenings he was at her place, which was most evenings. She cooked and he washed up and they talked over the table, and the conversations had long since stopped having any pretense of a specific subject, and were simply the talking of two people who had found each other interesting and could not quite stop. He knew he was in love with her. He had known it for some time with the resigned clarity of a man who has tried very hard to avoid a conclusion and finally arrived at it anyway. He was in love with her, and it was the kind of love that felt nothing like the things he had felt at 22 in Kansas. It was quieter and more serious and also more alarming, because it felt permanent in a way that earlier feeling had not. It felt like something with weight and consequence. He did not tell her. He did not tell her because the thing in Kansas was still sitting in him like that stone, and every time he thought about speaking plainly to her, every time he thought about asking her if what he saw in her face sometimes when she looked at him was what he thought it was, the stone shifted and reminded him that she did not know the whole of who he was, and that it was possible, perhaps probable, that the part she did not know would change the part she thought she did. In late June she found him. She had come up to the meadow above her north fence line to gather some wild herbs she used for cooking, and she had come over the rise and found him sitting with his back against a boulder in the afternoon light, repairing a trap spring with the careful, deliberate attention he gave to all mechanical things. He did not hear her until she was 20 feet away, which meant she saw his face before he rearranged it for company. And what she saw was a man who was entirely in his own thoughts, and whose thoughts had a quality about them that she recognized immediately because she had felt it herself. That specific solitude of someone carrying something privately that has been private for a very long time. She sat down in the grass nearby and did not say anything for a moment, and he looked up and found her watching him with an expression that was careful and kind. She said, "What is it that you do not tell me?" He looked at her for a long moment. She said, "I am not asking for anything. I am asking because I can see it and I think you ought to know that I can see it, and because whatever it is, you can tell me." He looked away at the mountains, at the long blue afternoon horizon of them, and he told her about Kansas. He told her about the deputy sheriff job, and the man he had arrested for robbery who had turned out to be the nephew of the county judge, and the way the judge had made it clear that the arrest would cost Daniel his badge if he proceeded, and the specific and agonizing choice he had made to let the man go because he had believed wrongly that there would be a better moment to fight that particular injustice. He told her how the man had robbed again 3 months later, and how a storekeeper had been shot and killed in the process, and how Daniel had carried the specific weight of that death for 5 years, because if he had held his ground and taken the consequences of arresting the nephew, if he had chosen his principles over his livelihood, a man might still be alive. He told her that Eliza had been the storekeeper's wife. Sarah was very quiet for a long time after he finished. He looked at her, unable to not look at her, needing to see what the knowing had done to her face. She was looking at the mountains, her hand still in the herbs in her lap, and when she turned to him her eyes were wet and clear, and she said, "You have been punishing yourself for 5 years for a choice you made in a corrupt system designed to force impossible choices." He said, "A man died." She said, "Yes. And the men who designed that system made it happen, not you." She paused. "I am not saying it was not a terrible thing to carry. I am saying you have been carrying it as though it makes you less trustworthy than you are, and I think that is wrong." He had not expected her to say any of that. She reached across the grass and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and neither of them said anything for a long time, and the afternoon light moved over the mountain in its long golden arc, and the thing he had been carrying began not to disappear because he did not think it would ever disappear entirely, but to be something that could be carried alongside another person rather than alone. After a while she said, "I am afraid too, you know." He said, "What are you afraid of?" She said, "I am afraid that I have been making myself safe for so long that I have forgotten how to be anything else. that I have made my independence such a fundamental part of myself that I do not know how to let someone matter to me without feeling as though I am surrendering something." He turned to look at her. She was looking back at him with that direct, careful gaze that had undone him from the first moment she had used it, and he said quietly, "Does someone matter to you?" She said just as quietly, "You know that they do." He reached up and touched her face with the back of his hand, the way you touch something you have wanted to touch for a long time and were afraid to, careful and deliberate, and she leaned into it with a small exhale that sounded like something releasing, and then he kissed her, there in the mountain meadow in the late June light with the smell of wild herbs around them, and it was nothing like the things he had been afraid of. It was as though the mountain had simply confirmed something it had known since October. They walked back to her cabin together in the long evening light, her hand in his, not saying very much, and when he left that night to walk back to his own place through the summer dark, he felt the shape of the mountain around him with a different kind of attention, not the solitude he had always known it by, but by the knowledge of where she was within it, the particular point of light that was her cabin window in the darkness of the valley. The summer was the best of his life. He understood that even as it was happening, which was unusual for him, because he tended to understand things in retrospect. She was learning the mountain and he was her guide, and there was a quality of pleasure in showing her things, the places where the mountain released its secrets to a patient observer, that he had not anticipated. He showed her the high lake above the tree line where the trout were enormous and stupid in July, and she fished with a natural competence that impressed him. He showed her the meadow where the elk came at dusk and they lay in the grass, and watched a herd of them for an hour without speaking, and her face in that hour had a quality of wonder in it that he wanted to remember for the rest of his life. He showed her the spring that Beaumont had discovered high on the north face, a hidden thing that ran clear and cold in the driest August. She showed him her garden, which had become magnificent, rows of vegetables with the kind of vigorous health that indicated a real gardener rather than someone who had merely planted things and hoped. She showed him her bread baking, the whole long process of it, with the serious methodology she brought to everything she cooked, and he sat at her kitchen table and watched, and she explained each step in the tone she used when she cared about being understood, and he thought that he could sit at this table for the rest of his life and not find it a hardship. He also thought, with increasing frequency and specificity, about what the rest of his life might look like if it looked like this. He was a man who lived in a cabin that was sufficient for one person, and adequate for none of the things he was beginning to want. He thought about this with the practical side of his nature, the side that had always been his most reliable part. He would need to build. He would need to think about the future in terms that were not purely his own. These were not things he thought with dread. They were things he thought with a kind of steady, growing certainty that was the closest thing he had ever felt to the relief of making the right decision. But he had not asked her anything yet. He had not asked her because, even now, even with everything that had passed between them, there was a part of him that held back from the final commitment of the question, because asking was the point of no return, and he was a man who had learned the cost of irreversible things. It was Sarah who made it irreversible. In late August, on an evening when they had eaten supper and were sitting on her porch in the warm purple dusk, watching the bats begin their evening circuits over the meadow, she said, without looking at him, in the same tone she used for stating practical facts, "I am not going anywhere, Daniel." He looked at her. She turned then and met his eyes and said, "I came to this mountain to make a life. I have made a life, and the life I have made has you in it, very centrally and importantly, and I would very much like it to continue that way for a long time, if you are agreeable to the idea." He looked at her for a moment, this woman who did everything with a directness that was at once exasperating and the most attractive thing he had ever encountered, and said, "Are you asking me to marry you?" She considered this for a moment and said, "I suppose I am." He said, "Then yes." She turned back to the bats and the purple sky, and he could see her smiling in profile. That quick, genuine smile that was over before it was fully started. And he put his arm around her and she leaned into him. And the mountain held them both in its ancient, indifferent way, and neither of them needed to say anything more about it. They married in October of 1883, 1 year almost to the day from when Sarah had first arrived on the mountain, in the parlor of the Alderman farmhouse, because the Aldermans had the largest room within reasonable distance and had extended the invitation with genuine warmth. Cal Alderman gave Sarah away with the solemnity of a man performing a genuine service, and the ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher, who came through Dunmore every 6 weeks, and who was a small, energetic man named Fuller, who treated the whole thing with appropriate dignity and visible pleasure. Pete Alderman was not present, having left the territory in July after a dispute with his father over some matter Daniel had not inquired about and felt no loss of sleep about. Sarah wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from Denver, dark blue wool with small white buttons, and she was not what anyone would call a traditionally spectacular bride. She had not powdered herself or done anything elaborate with her hair, and she was more beautiful to Daniel than anyone he had ever seen, because she looked exactly like herself. He told her this afterward, when they were walking back to the mountain in the first frost of the new season, and she laughed, which was a sound he intended to collect as many instances of as possible for the rest of his life. They spent their first winter as a married couple at her cabin, and it was a different winter than any he had known before. Not easier exactly, because the mountain did not become less demanding because you had company, but richer in a way that made the difficulty into something shared rather than merely endured. She baked her bread and he ran his trap lines, and they came together in the evenings with the satisfaction of two people who had spent a full day doing their own work and valued each other's the more for understanding what it cost. He started building in the spring. He had been planning the building all winter, making sketches in the evenings at the table after supper, showing her his ideas, modifying them based on her observations, which were numerous and invariably sensible. He wanted to join the two properties, hers and his, into a single working whole, which meant starting over with a new structure rather than trying to expand either existing cabin. He chose the site himself with the care he gave to all important decisions, a south-facing slope above her meadow, sheltered from the north wind, with the spring visible from what would be the kitchen window and the creak audible from the bedroom. The Aldermans helped. 3 neighbors from down the mountain whom he had worked with over the years came for the major raising days. There is a particular pleasure in watching a building go up with the labor of willing people who know what they are doing, and Sarah moved through it all with a quality of contained joy that he found himself looking for throughout every day, the way you look for the sun to confirm the weather. The new house was finished by September of 1884. It was not a grand house, but it was a serious one, solidly built with the knowledge of someone who had spent years learning what the mountain winters required, and with the particular attention to practical detail that both of them brought to everything. It had 4 rooms, a kitchen and parlor below and 2 bedrooms above, and a porch that faced south across the meadow with a view of the mountains that could stop you in your tracks if you allowed it to. They moved in on a Saturday in late September and spent the first night by the fire they built in the new fireplace, talking about everything and nothing, the way they always did, and went to sleep in the new bedroom in the new house in the mountains they both belonged to. And Daniel lay awake for a while after Sarah slept, listening to her breathe and listening to the mountain settle around the house, and felt something he could only describe as complete. By the following spring, Sarah knew she was expecting, and told him over breakfast with the same directness she brought to all significant communications, watching his face with that careful, attentive look she had when she genuinely wanted to know what he was thinking. He was thinking about his father's farm in Virginia and the 12 children and the poverty of it, and how nothing about this felt like that because they had chosen it and prepared for it, and wanted it with a deliberate love that was entirely different from the accidental multiplication of a hard life. He was thinking about the specific and extraordinary fact that he was going to be a father, and that the person making him a father was the woman sitting across the table from him, who had appeared on his mountain as a stranger and had changed the entire grammar of his interior life. He said, "I am very happy." She smiled, and it was not the quick, contained smile this time. It was a full and genuine and unhurried smile that he had only seen a few times, and that he considered a very great privilege. She said, "Good, so am I." The pregnancy was not entirely easy. The altitude and the summer heat combined in late July to give her headaches that were severe and debilitating for several days at a time. And he learned very quickly the particular kind of helplessness that comes from watching someone you love suffer something you cannot fix. He kept the house quiet and kept the horses and chickens and the rest of the daily work from interrupting her rest, and sat with her in the evenings with cold cloths for her forehead, and read to her from the small collection of books she had brought from Missouri. And she bore the whole thing with the characteristic toughness that was so completely herself that it sometimes frightened him, because there was something in the way she refused to dramatize her own suffering that made you want to dramatize it for her. He brought in a woman from Dunmore named Mrs. Crane, who had midwife experience, to be at the house for the final weeks. Mrs. Crane was a matter-of-fact woman of 50, with the specific authority of someone who has presided over many births and found most of them navigable, and her presence, which Daniel had suggested, and Sarah had accepted with a graciousness that might have been reluctance, made the final month less frightening than it would otherwise have been. The baby came in November of 1885, a boy, born into the first winter snowfall of the season in a house that was warm and solid and full of light. He was healthy and furious and had, according to Mrs. Crane, excellent lungs, which she delivered as a compliment. They named him James, after Sarah's father, and he had Daniel's dark hair and Sarah's brown eyes and absolutely nobody's peaceful disposition, being the loudest, most demanding, most comprehensively opinionated infant either of his parents had ever encountered. Daniel loved him with an intensity that startled him. He had expected to love his child, had prepared for it in the abstract way you prepare for things you have never experienced. But the specific, physical, immediate fact of this particular small person was something for which no preparation had been adequate. He lay awake in the early mornings listening to James breathe, the same way he had listened to Sarah breathe in the first months of their marriage, with that feeling of astonished gratitude that this life, this specific, particular life, was his. Sarah was magnificent with James. She was not naturally soft in the way that certain women were. She did not coo and exclaim in the conventional manner, but she was devoted with the same wholehearted practicality she brought to everything she loved, present and attentive and entirely committed to the small person who had commandeered their lives with absolute authority. James grew through his first winter and into the spring of 1886 with the robust vigor of a mountain-born child, becoming mobile with a speed that required constant supervision, and developing early and emphatic opinions about everything from the chickens to his father's beard. By the time he was walking confidently in the summer of 1886, he had reduced his parents to a state of cheerful exhaustion from which neither of them showed any sign of recovering. In June of 1886, Daniel rode down to Dunmore for supplies, his first solo trip to town in several months, and found the place more active than usual. There had been a silver strike of some significance in the hills to the west, and Dunmore was in the early stages of the particular fever that came over western towns when mineral wealth was newly proximate. The streets had new faces, the saloon was louder, a second general store was being built on the main street, and there was a quality of velocity in the air that was both energizing and slightly ominous. He bought what he needed, traded some furs at the trading post for a good price, and was loading his pack-horse at the rail when a man spoke his name. He turned and found, standing in the dust of the Dunmore Street, a man he had not seen in 6 years and had hoped never to see again. The man's name was Chet Mosley, and he was from Kansas, specifically from the town where Daniel had been a deputy. And seeing him now with the Silver Rush men moving around them and the afternoon sun cutting low through the dust, Daniel felt the old stone shift in him with a force he had not anticipated. Mosley was older, thicker around the middle, with a new scar along his jaw that Daniel did not remember and did not ask about. He said with a kind of careful casualness that was not casual at all, "Whitaker, heard you had settled up here somewhere. Good country." "It is," Daniel said. Mosley said, "There are some men from back home who have been asking around about you." Judge Fenwick's associates. Daniel felt the cold move through him despite the June heat. Judge Fenwick had been the judge in Kansas, the one whose nephew he had let go, the one whose nephew had then shot a man and made a dead man and an angry widow and a running sore in Daniel's conscience. Fenwick had retired 2 years after the incident, but his associates were not men who forgot or forgave political embarrassments, and Daniel had carried an awareness of that fact in the back of his mind since the day he had left Kansas. He said, "What do they want?" Mosley said, "Nothing good. You know how these things go. The new county government in Wichita is cleaning house, reforming the old corruption, and some of Fenwick's people are looking for someone to hold responsible for the storekeeper's death, so it is not one of them." Daniel understood exactly what this meant. It meant that if Fenwick's people found him, they were going to attempt to make him the responsible party for a killing that had been the direct result of their corruption, and they had enough connections in enough places to make that attempt credible. He said, "How much time do I have?" Mosley said, 2 or 3 weeks maybe, before they get this far. "I am telling you because whatever else happened, Whitaker, you were not a bad lawman and you did not deserve what came of it." Daniel looked at him for a moment, this complicated, flawed, occasionally decent man from a complicated and mostly flawed period of his life, and said, "I appreciate that." He rode home in the late afternoon light with the weight of it pressing on him like weather, thinking the whole way about how to tell Sarah. He did not consider not telling her for more than approximately 5 minutes, because that option had a shape he recognized and rejected. It was the shape of the error he had made in Kansas, the choice to keep a difficult truth private rather than face the consequences of sharing it, and he was not going to make that particular mistake again. She was in the garden when he rode in, with James installed in a small fenced area beside her where he could not do damage, and she looked up at his face as he dismounted and said immediately, "What happened?" He told her everything, that same evening, after James was asleep, in the kitchen with the lamp between them. He told her about Fenwick and the corruption and the nephew and the storekeeper's death, the whole story, not just the piece of it she already knew. He told her that Fenwick's men were looking for him, and that this might mean trouble, real trouble, the kind that could not be waited out. She listened to all of it without interrupting, with that absolute attention she brought to things that mattered, and when he finished she was quiet for a long moment, not the kind of quiet that preceded panic, but the kind that preceded a decision. She said, "We need a lawyer." He said, "There is not one in Dunmore." She said, "There is one in Silverton." "I know because I have been corresponding with one about the property deed." He stared at her. She said, "We ride to Silverton on Thursday, we tell him everything, we get the legal situation as clear as we can before these men arrive. You were a deputy acting within a corrupt system and you did not kill anyone. That is a defensible position." He said, "It is not that simple." She said, "Nothing worth having is simple." She reached across the table and took his hand, and her grip was firm and warm and completely steady. "Daniel, you do not have to carry this alone anymore. Do you understand that?" He looked at her across the lamp, this woman who had chosen him knowingly, who had accepted his past as part of the whole of him without using it as a bargaining chip or a reproach, who was sitting in their kitchen on their mountain treating his greatest fear as a practical problem to be solved with the same determined competence she brought to everything. And he said, "I am beginning to." They rode to Silverton on Thursday, which was 30 miles but a good road, with James bundled between them on the pack horse, and Mrs. Crane from Dunmore persuaded to travel with them to mind the child during the meetings. The lawyer in Silverton was a younger man than Daniel had expected, perhaps 35, with the look of someone who had come west specifically, because Western law offered more interesting problems than Eastern law, and he listened to the whole story with the focused, note-taking attention of a man who genuinely found it interesting. His name was Morris, and he said, after hearing everything, "The critical issue is documentation. Do you have anything from your time as deputy? Records of the arrest, of the judge's interference, anything written?" Daniel had, as it happened, kept a journal during that period of his life. It was at his cabin, in a box under the floor where he kept his most important papers. He had kept it out of a general habit of documentation that Beaumont had instilled in him, the old trapper's belief that a man who did not keep records was a man who could be erased. He had never thought of those records as legal protection, but now he understood what they were. Morris said, "If your journal documents the arrest and the judge's interference, we have the basis of a very strong case that you were acting appropriately and were prevented from completing your duty by corruption. If Fenwick's men arrive and attempt to bring charges, they will find themselves in a very difficult legal position." They rode home with something that felt like actual possibility rather than mere hope. Fenwick's men arrived in Dunmore in mid-July. There were 3 of them, and they had the look of men who were accustomed to things going their way, which was a look Daniel had seen before and found neither impressive nor intimidating. They had spoken to the sheriff in Dunmore, a solid man named Webb, before coming up to the mountain, and what they had told Webb was a version of events that bore a creative relationship to the truth. Webb had ridden up the mountain ahead of them to warn Daniel, which told Daniel everything he needed to know about Webb's assessment of the situation. He had said, "These men have a piece of paper from a Kansas court that looks official but does not hold up to scrutiny, and they have a story that depends on no one being able to corroborate your account. I am inclined to let Morris handle it before anything else happens." Morris had, in fact, already sent documentation to the county courthouse in Silverton, and to a federal circuit judge who traveled through that part of Colorado every quarter, documentation that included Daniel's journal entries, a deposition from Mosley who had agreed to provide one, and a detailed legal argument about the specific circumstances of the Kansas situation that made it very clear who had created the conditions for the storekeeper's death. The 3 men from Kansas spent 4 days in Dunmore. They came up to the property once on the second day, and Daniel met them at the gate politely, with Webb and a neighbor named Harris present as witnesses, and told them with complete calm that they were welcome to pursue their legal case through the appropriate channels, and that his lawyer in Silverton would be happy to receive any legitimate correspondence. He did not invite them inside. He did not raise his voice. He was as steady as the mountain behind him. They looked at him for a long time. One of them, the oldest, had the quality of a man recalculating, remeasuring the distance between where he was and where he needed to be and finding it larger than he had assumed. "Ed, we will be in touch," Daniel said. "I expect you will." They left on the 5th day and did not come back. Morris sent a letter 3 weeks later explaining that the Kansas court document had been found to have irregularities that rendered it void, and that the federal circuit judge had noted the case and indicated that any future attempt to bring charges based on the same set of events would be reviewed with specific attention to the documented corruption in the original circumstances. It was not a complete exoneration in any formal public sense, but it was the closest thing to one that the practical realities of 1886 were likely to produce, and it effectively closed the door on anything further. Sarah read the letter twice carefully and then set it on the table and looked at him and said, "Good." He said, "Good," she said, "is the stone lighter?" He thought about it honestly for a moment because she deserved honesty and had always given it. He said, "Not gone." "But lighter, yes," she said. "I think that is what resolution actually looks like. Not erasure, just lighter." He reached across and touched her face the way he had in the mountain meadow on that June afternoon 2 years ago, and she leaned into it the same way. And the kitchen was warm and James was asleep upstairs, and the mountain was deep in its late summer stillness outside, and the life they had built together was their own in every direction. The years that followed were full. The Silver Rush transformed Dunmore into a real town with a real main street and a real school and eventually a church. And the transformation was not entirely good, because growth was not always good. But it was interesting, and the Whitaker place was far enough up the mountain to remain largely outside the agitation of it. Daniel continued his trap lines through the winters and added a small cattle operation in the summers, a modest herd of a dozen head that grazed the upper meadow and produced enough income to make the place fully self-sustaining. Sarah expanded her garden into a genuine market garden and began selling produce and bread, her dark rye bread especially, to the boarding houses and restaurants that had appeared in Dunmore with the Silver Rush population, a business that was small but consistent and entirely hers. James grew into the mountains the way mountain children do, with a physical confidence and a specific knowledge of the country around him that was different from the learned knowledge his parents had acquired, and more instinctive for being absorbed in early childhood. By the time he was 4, he knew where the rabbit warrens were on the north side of the property and had strong opinions about the best fishing spots on the creek. By 5, he had given his father his first riding lesson in reverse, demonstrating a technique for approaching the horses that was, Daniel admitted to himself with a mixture of pride and mild wounded dignity, actually superior to his own. In the autumn of 1888, when James was 2 years old and the world was fully golden with October, Sarah told Daniel at breakfast, with that same direct, watching look, that James was going to have a sibling. Daniel said, "When?" She said, "May, I think." He said, "How are you feeling?" She said, "Better than last time already," and there was enough relief in her voice that he understood the last time had been harder than she had let show. He said, "I am going to be in this house more." She said, "You do not have to do that." He said, "I know I do not have to. I want to." She looked at him with the expression he loved best, which was the expression she got when something genuinely moved her that she was not going to make a dramatic thing of, a kind of internal brightness that did not quite make it fully to her face but affected the whole quality of her attention. She said, "All right." The second pregnancy was easier. The headaches were less severe and less frequent, and she was in general more energetic, which she attributed to being better acclimatized to the altitude. 3 years of living at 8,000 feet having apparently convinced her body that this was a reasonable place to exist. She worked through the winter with her usual determination, slowing only in the final weeks of spring when, she said with characteristic understatement, things were becoming physically inconvenient. The second baby was born in May of 1889, in the same bedroom where James had been born, with the same Mrs. Crane presiding, and was a girl, smaller than James had been and quieter, which immediately struck everyone who had spent any time with James as a genuinely astonishing developmental direction. They named her Anna, after Daniel's mother, who had died when he was 12 and whose name he had carried since as a quiet, private memorial. James approached Anna with the cautious, territorial curiosity of a small person confronting an unexpected variable in an otherwise well-understood environment, and after approximately 2 weeks of careful assessment, apparently decided she was acceptable, and from that point forward appointed himself her primary guardian against all threats both real and imagined, a role he took with an earnestness that made his parents exchange looks of helpless affection over his head. Anna grew into a person who was unlike either of her parents in some ways, and exactly like both of them in others. She had Sarah's directness and Daniel's capacity for quiet, and she had from very early on a quality of observation that was almost preternatural, the habit of watching a situation completely before engaging with it, as though she were making a thorough assessment before committing. She was also, when she did speak, incisively funny in a way that was entirely her own, and that regularly reduced both her parents to laughter that surprised them, which she accepted with a composed satisfaction that was almost regal. James and Anna together were a specific and powerful force of nature that the Whitaker household organized itself around with the cheerful pragmatism of people who have recognized an unstoppable thing and decided to work with it rather than against it. The school in Dunmore opened in 1890, and both children attended it from the appropriate ages, which meant the daily trip down the mountain and back, first with a parent and then, as they got older, with each other. The teacher was a young woman from Ohio named Miss Peters, who was 22 years old and entirely serious about her work. And she told Sarah at the end of the first term that James was one of the most capable students she had ever taught, and that he had a particular aptitude for mathematics that she thought ought to be encouraged. Sarah came home from that meeting with a quality of contained pride that Daniel recognized as very similar to the pride she had about her bread, which was to say profound and deeply personal and expressed entirely through continued application. He told her that evening that he thought James had her stubbornness and her intelligence, and that the combination was going to take him somewhere remarkable, and she had said, "He has your patience and your precision," and they had sat in comfortable agreement about the excellences of their son, until James himself appeared at the top of the stairs to ask if anyone had seen his arithmetic book, and the spell broke in the cheerful, ordinary noise of a household. In 1891, Daniel did something he had been thinking about for years, but had not done for reasons that were private and complicated. He wrote a letter to the family of the storekeeper who had been killed in Kansas, a letter that had taken him many drafts and several months to get right, in which he told the full truth of what he had done, and what he had failed to do, and what the consequences had been, and expressed without asking for anything in return the sorrow he had carried for a decade for the role his compromise had played in their loss. He mailed it on a Tuesday in March, and tried not to spend too much time waiting for the reply. The reply came 6 weeks later, from the storekeeper's son, who was now a grown man of 24 running the rebuilt store in the Kansas town. The letter was brief and honest and said that he had known for years that corruption, and not any individual deputy's weakness, had killed his father, and that the family had not blamed Daniel and would not have wanted him to spend his life under that weight. It said that he hoped Daniel was well and living somewhere he deserved. Daniel read this letter 3 times alone in the meadow above the house, in the early spring light with the creek audible below, and then he folded it carefully and put it in his coat, and went back to the house where Sarah was in the garden and James was arguing with a fence post about something, and Anna was watching both of them with her characteristic composed assessment, and he went to Sarah and told her what the letter had said. She listened, and when he finished she put down her garden tools and put her arms around him, there in the garden in the spring light, in the deliberate and unhurried way she did everything, and held him for a long time, and he let himself be held. The stone was gone, not lighter, gone. In the years after that, the life on the mountain became the kind of life that does not lend itself easily to dramatic narration, not because nothing happened, but because the texture of it was the texture of genuine happiness, which is made of ordinary things assembled with care. Daniel ran his trap lines and his small cattle operation, and built things when things needed building and helped neighbors when neighbors needed help, and was known in the Dunmore country as a man of absolute reliability and considerable skill, whose word meant exactly what it said. Sarah ran her garden and her bread business, and served for 3 years on the school board after Miss Peters moved on, and a new teacher needed community support, and was known in the same country as a woman who spoke plainly and listened carefully, and could be trusted with anything from a secret to a broken tool. Their children grew into themselves in the particular way of mountain children, with a seriousness and a capability that did not preclude joy, knowing exactly who they were and where they belonged in a way that their parents, who had both arrived at themselves through much harder roads, recognized as a gift and tried never to take for granted. James at 16 was tall like his father and dark-haired, and had a quiet authority that was entirely his own, not borrowed from anyone, and was studying mathematics and engineering through correspondence courses that the school board had helped arrange, with the stated intention of attending a proper college somewhere that offered those subjects. Daniel had the conversation with him about what that meant and what it would cost, a practical and serious conversation, and Sarah had another conversation with James about what it meant to want things and go after them, which was a different kind of conversation, and which James came away from looking thoughtful in a way he did not look after the practical conversation. Anna at 14 was her own complete person in a way that made Daniel think of Sarah as he had first seen her on that cold February morning, something vivid and direct and entirely itself. She wanted to be a doctor, which she announced at 13 with the specificity of someone who had already done their research, and she wanted this with the kind of clarity that indicated it was not a passing ambition but a genuine vocation. Sarah had sat with Anna for a long time the evening that conversation happened, and Daniel, watching from the doorway of the kitchen, had seen something pass between them that was beyond his full understanding, the particular communication of two women across a generation, something about what it cost to want things and what it was worth, and how to be brave enough to want them anyway. He had been extremely glad, watching that conversation, that Sarah Hale had left Missouri. The bread continued. It was a thing they never discussed formally, the originating act of their whole strange and perfect story, but it was present in every loaf she baked, and in every morning he came to the table and found it there, in the way they both knew what it had meant and had let it mean everything it had in fact meant. She baked every week, the dark rye bread of their first winter, and it was never quite the same twice because she was always adjusting it, improving it with the slow patience she brought to mastery, and he ate it every week and had never found it anything other than extraordinary. On the morning of their 10th wedding anniversary in October of 1893, he went out at first light before she was awake and left a perfectly dressed pheasant on the porch board, the first game he had left there since the previous winter when their courtship had been conducted entirely in silence. He went back inside and made the coffee and waited. She came down at 6:30, went to the porch for the morning air as she always did, and stood there for a long moment. Then he heard her laugh, a full, genuine, unhurried laugh, entirely unlike the quick, contained version, the real one that she gave to things that genuinely surprised her with their beauty. She came inside with the pheasant and found him at the table with the coffee and sat down across from him and looked at him with those brown eyes that had been his compass point in his home for 10 years and said, 10 years. He said, 10 years. She said, I never did thank you properly for that first rabbit. He said, the bread was thanks enough. She reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and the October light came through the kitchen window that looked out on the mountain, and the mountain was magnificent in its autumn colors, the aspens gone gold against the dark spruce, and the sky above everything a blue so deep it was almost violet. Downstairs in a few hours James would come down for breakfast with his serious morning face and his mathematics books, and Anna would come down after him with a novel under her arm and an opinion about something, and the house would fill up with the specific and irreplaceable noise of their particular family. But right now in the early morning quiet, it was just the two of them at the table with the coffee and the October light, and the mountain holding them in its ancient, impartial way, and the life they had built between them, from silence and snow and game left on a porch and bread set out in the morning, from courage and honesty, and the particular bravery of deciding to let another person matter to you when you had very good reasons to keep yourself safe. From a conversation conducted all winter long in the only language that had felt safe enough to use, and from the extraordinary patience of two people who had needed to find each other and had found each other anyway here, in these mountains, in this cold and beautiful country that had been the right place for both of them from the beginning. Daniel brought her hand up and pressed it to his face, and she let him, and the coffee cooled slowly in the cups, and neither of them was in any hurry at all. They had all the time that the mountain gave them, and it gave them many years, and they used every one of them fully and deliberately, and with the specific gratitude of people who understood what it cost to find something real and knew exactly what they had. James did go to college in Denver, studying engineering, and came back to the San Juan Mountains afterward not because he had to, but because he wanted to, because the mountains were his and he knew it. And he built bridges in that part of Colorado for 30 years, and was good at it in the way his parents were good at things, thoroughly and without vanity. He married a woman from Silverton who was clever and wry, and who Sarah said within the first 10 minutes of meeting her was exactly right, which she considered a high compliment, and which she was. Anna became a doctor, which required more fighting than it should have and less than she had feared, with her mother's practical stubbornness and her father's specific patience carrying her through the difficult years. She practiced in Denver for 20 years and then came back to the mountains because she had always known she would, and became the physician for the Dunmore country, which by that time had changed enormously from the raw silver rush town of the 1880s, but still needed, as all places do, someone with the knowledge and the willingness to show up in all weathers for people who needed help. Sarah and Daniel grew old together in the house on the south-facing slope above the meadow, in the house he had built for both of them with his hands and the help of good neighbors, the house that had held 40 years of their particular life by the time the century turned. The garden was still tended, less ambitious than it had been but still productive. The bread was still baked every week, the dark rye bread that the whole country knew her by. Daniel still walked the mountain in the mornings, slower than he had been, not as far as he had gone in the years when the high country trap lines had been his whole compass, but still out there, still listening to the specific language of the place he had given his life to. He brought her wildflowers sometimes, in the summer, which was not a habit he had started young but one that had developed gradually over the decades, the way many of the best habits did. She put them in a jar on the kitchen table with the same matter-of-fact pleasure she brought to good things that appeared without making a performance of themselves. They were, by any honest accounting, extraordinarily happy. Not perfectly, because nothing was perfectly, because life in hard country was hard and loss came as it came to everyone, and the world did not become less complicated because you had found the right person in it. But they were happy in the deep, confirmed way of people who had chosen their life with open eyes, and found that it was, in fact, the life they had wanted, that the choosing had been good, and the living had been good, and that the person across the table from you every morning was still, after all these years, genuinely interesting to you. That was the gift of it, Daniel thought, on many mornings in their late years, watching Sarah read at the kitchen table with the same focused attention she had brought to everything her whole life, or watching her in the garden with her hands in the soil she had first turned 40 years ago. The gift was not that it had been easy, because it had not been easy, none of it, not the coming to this place or the surviving the first winter or the building of the life or the raising of the children or the navigating of the things that came for them from the outside world. The gift was that none of it had been faced alone. The gift was the bread on the board in the morning and the game on the porch step and the note that said, "I would like to know who I am speaking with." And the answer, Daniel Whitaker. And everything that had followed.